Good afternoon, students of Mount St. Mary's University, and welcome back to Intro to Philosophy. My name is Ed Keenan. Today we're going to be talking about the nature of thoughts with my friend Professor Martin.
Hi, all. I hope you're doing well and staying safe. Today, I want to talk about continuing the theme of theories of truth, Gottlob Frege's theory of language and truth. Frege was born in 1848. He lived until 1925. He was German. He worked during his life on the frontiers of mathematics and logic, and he was a fairly systematic philosopher in certain regards. Unfortunately, he was also a proto-Nazi, and this came out during writings later in his life that are to some extent separable from his kind of philosophical thinking and work. He poses a contrast to Heidegger, a person whose life temporally overlapped with Frege's and who was an out-and-out Nazi. Um, Frege's work is, in some ways, remarkably mathematically elegant, and he's a very gifted writer. His thinking is concerned with how it is we could understand, in very general terms, the functioning of our language and how we ought to model that correctly, or what an adequate model of it would have to seemingly incorporate. He's going to be what we can call a neo-platonist. So recall Plato's theory of the forms. Frege is arguing that some picture like that is very close to correct. And he begins this with a very kind of general search or inquiry into how we might think about the nature of truth and what discipline would be concerned with the sort of laws of truth. So he says, the word true indicates the aim of logic, as does beautiful that of aesthetics, or good that of ethics. All sciences have truth as their goal, but logic is also concerned with it in a quite different way from this. It has much the same relation to truth as physics has to weight or heat. To discover truth is the task of all sciences. It falls to logic to discern the laws of truth. So there's a kind of difference in focus. All theories have the aim to discover truths, but logic is particularly concerned with the nature of truth itself. It says, when we speak of laws of morals or the state, we mean regulations which ought to be obeyed, but with which the actual happenings are not always in conformity. In other words, even though something ought to be the case, it doesn't necessarily follow that it will be the case. Whereas with logic, logic is concerned with like what must be. And so there would be no particular concrete deviation from it. Laws of nature are the generalizations of natural occurrences within which the occurrences are always in accordance. It is rather in this sense that I speak of laws of truth. So it's not merely a kind of like normative notion about expecting what ought to be the case. It is something about what is. And turning to the sort of question of how it is that we should think about meaning in a very general sense. We'll see shortly there are certain kinds of puzzles that motivate Frege, but we can begin to see some of the kind of considerations at play here. What does one call a sentence? A series of sounds, but only when it has a sense. So you could have a series of sounds that is something like boo boo boo, and this doesn't necessarily have any sort of sense associated with it in English or any other natural language which is spoken. But by which is not meant that every series of sounds that has sense is a sentence. So there are also cases in which something has sense. Say, if I say, close the door, then this has a sense. One could say close the door and. This would not be fully grammatical, and yet there is a sense involved here that's identifiable. When we call a sentence true, what we really mean is that its sense is. In other words, you could say, for instance, snow is white or la nieve es blanca, but what is true is not the particular English or Spanish utterance, but the sort of informational content that is expressed through that natural language. And this is what he's going to call the sense. From which it follows that it is for the sense of a sentence that the question of truth arises in general. Now, is the sense of a sentence an idea? And by idea here, he means something which is objective, subjective, and private. So you have first personal immediate access to ideas. This deviates from the sort of Platonic usage of ideas, which is what Frege will come close to describing with his notion of thought. So an idea is something that is within your mind, whereas we'll see Frege thinks that the thought is something that has a kind of objective and to some extent kind of public access. So you and I can have the same thought or have the same belief. In any case, or now, is the sense of a sentence an idea? In any case, being true does not consist in the correspondence of this sense with something else. For otherwise the question of truth would reiterate itself to infinity. What he's saying here is that the sense cannot correspond to something if correspondence is understood as something like identity, because then it's going to be the case that you have, say, something like a mental representation. The only thing which is going to be absolutely identical to it is that very mental representation. But say if you seek to describe like some building or whatnot, and in your mind you have a mental representation of that, then the mental representation, or what we might call one sort of mode of presentation of the thing in question, will either represent it accurately or will not. In the case where it represents it accurately, then we could say the sense sort of determines or picks out that referent, the actual object. So I call a thought something for which the question of truth arises. I ascribe what is false to a thought just as much as what is true. So thoughts or propositions, independent of their truth value, exist in a kind of flat way. So the proposition that, say, Mars is red exists, but so does the proposition that Mars is blue. There's no difference in their existence. And part of the reason Frege thinks this, and we'll look at this again shortly, is that if I believe that Mars is blue, then although my belief is false, I must relate to that proposition. And so in order for the claim that I believe that Mars is blue to have the possibility of being true, it must be the case that the proposition already exists and I can relate to it. So I can say, the thought is the sense of a sentence, without wishing to say as well that the sense of every sentence is a thought. The thought, in itself immaterial, clothes itself in the material garment of a sentence, and thereby becomes comprehensible to us. We say that a sentence expresses a thought. So note here, the sentence is going to be a particular concrete thing. It's a pile of ink or some arrangement of color on the screen of your computer. A thought is something immaterial, and everything material and percepted is excluded from this sphere of that for which the question of truth arises. In other words, say, this table cannot be true or false. That would be a kind of category mistake. This is what Frege is suggesting. Truth is not a quality that corresponds with a particular type of sense impression. So it is sharply distinguished from the qualities with which we denote the words red, bitter, lilac smelling. But do we not see that the sun has risen, and do we not then also see that this is true? Note there's a kind of metaphorical use of see in the second place. In the first place, you could describe the experience in terms of a sense impression, whereas in the latter case, seeing that it's true that the sun has risen, this involves a kind of more cognitive thing, what Frege will later call sort of grasping a concept. So, that the sun is risen is not an object which emits rays that reach my eyes. It is not a visible thing, like the sun itself. That the sun has risen is seen to be true is not seen to be true. The sun has risen is seen to be true on the basis of sense impressions. But being true is not a material, perceptible quality. So one moves from the sense impression to the sort of cognitive recognition. For being magnetic is also recognized on the basis of sense impressions of something, though this property corresponds as little as truth with a particular kind of sense impression. So far, these properties agree. However, we need sense impressions in order to recognize a body as magnetic. So, two kind of puzzles that motivate some of Frege's thinking here. So, the first has to do with handling the way in which we model and think about ascriptions of belief. So, take a kind of base proposition, say 2 is even. Frege's idea is that this is made true because 2 is a term that picks out some particular mathematical object, and it has the property of evenness. Now, 3 is even does not exist, but there has to be the proposition, or 3 does not have the property of evenness, but the proposition that 3 is even is separable from that. It represents something which is not the case. And so it can be the case that someone relates to that proposition by means of belief. So we want to be able to develop a kind of model which can explain both claims like, I believe that 2 is even is true. And part of what this shows is there's a content that goes beyond just the referent of the base belief. It's about my relation to some further thing, something that represents that as being the case. And so, in virtue of this sort of positing of this realm of abstracta that represent objects, some of which may be abstract themselves, as numbers are, gives us a means of explaining how it could be the case that, say, Sam believes that 3 is even is true, even when it's not true that 3 is even. The second kind of case that motivates some of Frege's thinking is he thinks about statements that involve co-referential terms, and he says, look, it seems very obvious that the morning star is the morning star, that statement is true. I can discern that without any sort of experience. I don't need to go and investigate anything. I can recognize the truth of this in an a priori and analytic matter. But with statements like the morning star is the evening star, both of these terms refer to the same object, the planet that we call Venus, and yet it seems like the morning star is the evening star is a cognitively significant sort of statement, whereas it's not sort of readily apparent that the morning star is the morning star is a cognitively significant statement. You don't seem to gain new information by means of it, whereas with the latter statement, it seems like you do. So this poses a significant problem for a purely referential theory of meaning. And what Frege is suggesting is that we need a kind of intentional account of meaning, but one which posits a kind of objective realm of being, of abstract objects, that we, as individual minds, can then all relate to. So, the manner in which Frege advocates we kind of resolve this problem is he proposes a kind of trilemma. And he says, well, if something exists, then it's either physical, mental, or abstract. And it's worth noting that these categories are meant to be mutually exhaustive, meaning they cover everything. Everything should fall into one of these categories. This doesn't necessarily mean that everything will occupy only one of these categories. It's possible that something could be simultaneously mental and physical. So this is not meant to arbitrate various disputes in the philosophy of mind between, say, dualists and materialists. It's compatible with, say, experience being accounted for both in terms of subjective experience and in terms of some objective psychological, neurological phenomena. So a physical thing is quantifiable in terms of its primary properties. This means that we can locate it, so to speak, within time and space. It has some extension thereof, or has property like mass. It has these things sort of independently of its relation to other things. And there are a kind of derivative set of qualities that has in virtue of these primary qualities and in virtue of its relation to our perceptual systems. So, in virtue of our perceptual systems, things have certain kind of smells, or they are represented as having certain colors. Those things might be perceived differently for beings with slightly different physiology. And so, even amongst humans, like one person could see red where another person does not, or they see like in grayscale. So, physical properties then are things which we should be able to quantify in this manner. They kind of occupy some span within space and time. Things that are mental are objects of subjective experience. So things like particular sensations, like say a pain or a mental image or a presentation, impressions more broadly, other kinds of psychological phenomena like desires or intentions could be mental. Um, and abstract things are defined in contrast to these two prior categories. So to say something is abstract is to say that it's non-physical, non-mental, and generally philosophers think of abstract objects as those without any sort of temporal location. So they don't occur here or tomorrow or in the past. They exist sort of outside of space and time. So prime candidates for these sorts of things are things like categories, but meanings also end up being quite easily explicable using a model that involves abstract objects. These things don't have any sort of causal power in themselves, so abstract objects can't make you do things, but Frege thinks we can somehow sort of apprehend their nature. Reason has this capacity, so they don't enter into any direct kind of causal relation. They can't push or pull things. They can't be causes or the reason that something occurs in some explanation of an event, but they provide sort of a way of understanding the way in which the world is carved, perhaps, or we can think of them as being what constitutes a language. And so we have particular kind of sense impressions, we have particular sonic utterances, and those are encoded by things like meanings and abstract objects. Frege distinguishes between mental and physical things in the following ways. He says, ideas are distinct from things of the outer physical world, and that ideas themselves we actually can't have any sort of like sensory physical contact with. can't see or touch an idea. They can't be smelled or tasted or heard. They don't have any like weight or mass. So the idea of the Parthenon is weightless, whereas the Parthenon itself is quite heavy. Frege describes various sort of scenarios in which you might illustrate these distinctions. He says, I go for a walk with a companion, and I see a green field. I have a visual impression of green as well, but I do not see like green, the color. I see the field. One has sensations, moods, feelings, inclinations, wishes. An idea is a content of consciousness. Ideas need a bearer, whereas things of the outer world are independent. So the impression of a field necessarily implies the existence of some bearer of that impression, whereas the field does not necessitate or entail or imply the existence of any sort of observer. My companion and I are convinced that we both see the same field, but each of us has a particular sense impression of green. I notice a strawberry among the green strawberry leaves. My companion does not notice it. He is colorblind. The color impression he receives from the strawberry is not noticeably different from the one he receives from the leaf. So there's this sort of substantive difference between the actual nature of the material there, but it's not represented within one's sort of subjective experience in the case of the colorblind person. Whereas, so there's a sort of possibility of a gap or of a distance between what is perceived and what is. So the physical has a kind of objective status, whereas the mental occupies this sort of like subjective sphere of consciousness. So every idea has only one bearer. Nobody else can bear your sense impression. So again, he's using this notion of an idea in the sort of subjective sense. So you have subjective immediate access to any particular idea you have. Nobody else does. But Frege notes, well, it seems like we can have like the same belief, or we can entertain the same thought. So if an idea had more than one bearer, then it would have to exist independently of that bearer and independently of the other one. And Frege thinks that this is what will be true of what he calls thoughts or propositions or concepts. So if the thought I express in the Pythagorean theorem can be recognized by others just as much as by me, then it does not belong to the content of my consciousness alone. I am not its bearer, yet I can nevertheless recognize its truth. So on the kind of objectivity that he thinks we ought to attribute to these thoughts or propositions, he notes, well, the mental is immediately available and it is subjective, and it's here that Berkeley seemed to suggest, well, we can't go sort of beyond this in a way. Frege says that to have an account of a kind of objective, mind-independent world, what must still be added is something nonsensible. And yet this is just what opens up the outer world for us. For without this nonsensible something, everyone would remain shut in his inner world. So since the answer lies in the nonsensible, perhaps something nonsensible could also lead us out of the inner world and enable us to grasp thoughts where no sense impressions were involved. So Frege is saying that if I'm to explain the truth of a claim such as, I see that tree, then that requires that the tree exist independently of my subjective experience. And he is saying it is reasonable for us to posit that, and likewise it's reasonable for us to posit the existence of thought, which could give us an explanation of what it is that we mean and how it is that we could have the same belief as some other person. Outside one's inner world, one would have to distinguish the proper outer world of sensible perceptible things from the realm of the non-sensibly perceptible. We should need something non-sensible for the recognition of both realms, but for the sensible perception of things, we should need sensible impressions as well. These become the medium by which we identify these things. These belong entirely to the inner world, so that in which the distinction between the way in which a thing and a thought is given mainly consists in something which is attributable not to both realms, but to the inner world. The way in which we represent physical objects and the way in which we represent abstract objects differs, but Frege thinks this difference is not so magnitudinous that we ought to reject the existence of abstract objects. Because it would be impossible for a thought to be given that did not belong to the inner world. So you have a kind of mental representation, say, of the horse Pegasus, and that then gives you a common way of describing a particular object which does not exist, but propositions about Pegasus exist. There are kind of looming epistemological considerations, because Frege is a neo-platonist and consequently a rationalist. He thinks that there's this substantive work done by reason, that it is capable of perceiving the contours of an immaterial realm. And some philosophers, namely nominalists, think that we ought to doubt the existence of such things. And he considers some kind of proximate concerns. He says, what value could there be for us in the eternally unchangeable, which could neither undergo effects nor have effect on us? Something entirely and in every respect inactive would be unreal and non-existent for us. Even the timeless, if it is to be anything for us, must somehow be implicated with the temporal. In other words, these propositions, in order for them to have any particular significance for us, must enter into some kind of relation with objects in the spatio-temporal world. In other words, you must somehow grasp the thought, and that then provides you the sort of causal means or motivation to act on it. It is possible. What would a thought be for me that was never apprehended by me? But by apprehending a thought, I come into a relation to it and it to me. It is possible that the same thought that is thought by me today was not thought by me yesterday. In this way, the strict timelessness of it is, of course, annulled. But one is inclined to distinguish between essential and inessential properties, and to regard something as timeless if the changes it undergoes involve only its inessential properties. In these sort of relational properties where I, say, token a particular thought, I have the idea in my mind, I believe it and affirm it to be true, then I am interacting with the proposition, but these interactions are encapsulated in a kind of broader model in terms of relations, and the things which we committed to are myself and the proposition. Those relations are sort of inessential properties of it. How does a thought act? By being apprehended and taken to be true. This is a process in the inner world of a thinker, which can have further consequences in this inner world, and which, encroaching on the sphere of the will, can also make itself noticeable in the outer world. If, for example, I grasp the thought which we express by the theorem of Pythagoras, the consequence may be that I recognize it to be true, and further that I apply it, making a decision which brings about the acceleration of masses. Thus our actions are usually prepared by thinking and judgment, and so thought can have an indirect influence on the motion of masses. So Frege is suggesting a kind of way of resolving one sort of puzzle associated with abstract objects. He's saying, well, so they can't be sort of causally efficacious in their own right, but what role do they play? Well, when you sort of represent a proposition, then that can play a particular role in your thinking, and it can be causally integrated into some kind of project. When you transmit information, you are sort of invoking or instantiating the proposition. And that then may play a significant role in the thinking of others, and thus it has this sort of indirect causal implication. Perhaps worth noting here that one might think, well, this gives us a very useful model for thinking about how we talk about our language, but it's possible that this same sort of indirect causal influence might be explicable in terms of our beliefs that these things are representing real propositions, that no such things exist. This is the foundations or fairly core considerations to a philosophical program called semantic fictionalism. Okay, so we've covered a little bit of Frege's theory and talked about the distinction between mental, physical, and abstract objects, why Frege thinks we ought to be committed to the existence of such things, some of the roles they play in his overall theory. And if you have any questions, please let me know. And I hope you have a good day, and I will see you next time.